Ladies and gentlemen, now it's my great honor to introduce Peter Thiel, our closing keynote speaker. Peter Thiel, who co-founded PayPal and who was the early investor in Facebook, doesn't need to be introduced. You all know about it. I want to introduce him by way of an anecdote about his earlier work that I had a chance to observe as an undergrad at Stanford. One day, there was no longer the Stanford Daily on campus, the usual politically correct left-wing student newspaper. Stanford is a very liberal, in the American sense, campus. There was also the Stanford Review that Peter co-founded. And that sounds trivial, perhaps, found a student newspaper, but it was a conservative, and still is, a conservative newspaper. And he got attacked, and the paper got attacked. And I remember students trashing the newspaper just after it being printed to make sure students couldn't read it. So Peter Thiel has been an innovateur for a long time, for radical innovations for a long time. He hasn't been afraid of controversy, and he has been a contrarian for a long time, and I admire that greatly. Today, he heads the Founders Fund, a venture capital firm, and Clarium Capital, a private equity firm, and he's also a philanthropist. So, Lisa, as you said, this is the transition to venture philanthropy with his Thiel Foundation and the Thiel Fellowships that reward people who don't finish college, but leave college or university to start a company. Also a very controversial and I think a very worthwhile idea. Please join me in welcoming our closing keynote speaker, Peter Thiel.
Thank you very much. I wanted to just start with a few different observations about technology, investing, starting businesses, and then leave as much time as possible for questions and make this as interactive a discussion as possible. There's been a tremendous amount written in the last number of years about Facebook and the crazy Facebook history, but I wanted to talk about one anecdote from the development of the company that I think was quite important and that it's worth reflecting on a little bit more in this question of how one builds great businesses. And you know, this question, was Facebook just lucky? Was it just, did they just stumble on this thing and it happened to grow? And I think there was certainly some serendipity and luck around it, but I also think there was a tremendous amount of foresight that I got to see firsthand in the company, where already in the summer of 2004, there were ideas about how they wanted to build things out and how they envisioned this completely transformative social network that would be built over many years. There are aspects of it that varied and changed over time, but in many ways, the outline of something much bigger was already envisioned near the very beginning of the company when I started to become involved in the summer of 2004. Perhaps one of the most important things that Facebook did very well was that the company was never sold. And that one of the things that you have happen if you have one of these successful ventures is people will offer to buy the company, and you will be tempted to sell the company. But if you sell it, it can never, it will always be limited to something less than it might have otherwise been. And I think the single most dramatic episode of this probably occurred in July of 2006. At the time, Facebook had about 5 million members. The revenues were maybe 35 million in 2006. There were no profits. And Yahoo was interested in buying the company for $1 billion. And so we had a board meeting on a Monday morning. There were 3 of us on the board at the time, and I think both myself and the other venture capitalist, Jim Breyer, on the board, were probably at least mildly, in favor of selling the company. And Mark Zuckerberg started the meeting off by saying, it's 8:30 on a Monday morning. This is as good a time as any to kill a deal. And we spent 6-7 hours talking about it. It was a very long meeting. And at the end, it was like a little bit less clear, was still somewhat against it. And the reason was that there were all these things that he was hoping that Facebook would accomplish over the next few years that you could not do if the company would be sold. So it was this definite plan about the future that would be lost if it was acquired by a bigger company. And the idea was that people were not valuing this definitive plan about the future in any way that was nearly appropriate. And so anyway, at the end of the day, it was close. Yahoo ended up backing off a little bit. The deal got killed. It didn't happen. And the plan gradually got implemented over time. Now, I think this is quite unusual because this is not the way most people in the United States or the developed world, for that matter, Western Europe, think about the future. If we ask people, what does the future look like in 10 years, 20 years, the most characteristic thing of the advanced economies is that people have no idea at all. They have no opinion about how things will be specifically better in 20 years, what kinds of technologies will be developed. I mean, there certainly are trends people can extrapolate, maybe 6-month type trends, so we can say there will be more people using cell phones in 6 months, so there's some very banal things like this. But this idea of what the future looks like 20, 30 years from now is a topic that's almost completely absent. And in this way, there's a striking contrast between the US and other developed countries and the emerging markets, most notably China, where China has a very definite view of what the future looks like. And the definite view is that the future will basically, they will be developing the country in certain ways. It's a somewhat straightforward future in some ways. They're basically going to be catching up to the developed world. So it'll be 19th century plumbing and 20th century railroads. Some things they might maybe go straight to wireless communications and not need landlines and things like that. But there is actually a definitive 20-year plan. And in some ways, I think one of the questions that's worth asking is how much of the future should be definite and how much should be indefinite, and what are the advantages and disadvantages of thinking about it in these sort of more definite versus more indefinite kinds of terms. I would say that one of the thoughts on this is that this idea of the idea of a definite future, I think not only helps anchor decisions and enable you parenthetically, this is not really a political or ideological thing, or at least it cuts in ideologically very different ways. So if you believe the future is definite, it means that there's something human beings can do to influence it. And it could be done by individuals or by governments. And so a definite future is compatible with classical liberalism, it's compatible with communism, and sort of planning, whether it's by individuals or the state. An indefinite future is actually compatible with neither. And it is for this reason that I think you can say China is in some ways a country that's both classically liberal in some ways and communist. It's both at the same time because there's an idea that people can make decisions about what their future is going to be. And the US, Western Europe, by contrast, are in the most important respects neither classically liberal nor communist, because people do not believe that human beings are fundamentally responsible for the future. And our dominant ideology tends to, by contrast, be that the future will be determined by subhuman or superhuman forces. It will be determined by nature, by fate, by the environment, by God, by the markets, and not by human beings. And this way in which human agency has disappeared is I think, a very interesting phenomenon over the last 40 years. And we can there are all sorts of ways it manifests itself. So I think the dominant way people think about the future used to involve something like math, used to be driven by calculus, where you make precise calculations about the future. Today, the dominant form of mathematics is statistics, where it's just a probability distribution, and you don't have any certainty about the future, you just have certainty about your uncertainty. And so insurance or finance have become these extremely dominant forms of activity, and they in some ways enshrine this sort of view of the future as something that's fundamentally unknowable and indefinite. Now, what I would suggest is that even though I don't think we can be like China, there are some things from this more definitive future view that are worth looking at. And there obviously are ways in which China cannot be emulated because it has an easier task. It simply is catching up to the developed world. But that does not mean that thinking about the future makes no sense in the developed nations. And in this way, the 1950s, 1960s were a period, or probably even from the beginning of the industrial age on, when people had very active conversations about the future. There were a lot of debates what it would look like. And I think you had, science fiction was the classic literary genre, which was a genre about the future. The collapse of science fiction as a literary form in the last 40 years probably mirrors this way in which we no longer think about the future very much. And you had, it sort of manifested itself in things like a space program, ideas about exploring the oceans, turning deserts into arable farmland, reforesting deserts, all kinds of large transformative projects that would be coordinated over many years, again, individually or through the state, were very much part of the ethos, and that has largely disappeared. Now, I think one of the things that's very different from China that I want to highlight, if we want to try to go back towards a more definitive future, what's very different between China and the West is that China, in a way, is all about globalization. The West is about technology. Globalization means extensive horizontal growth where you're going from one to N. You take things that work and you copy them. And so there is something about globalization that's very, very straightforward. It's somewhat mechanical. It's somewhat automatic. You don't need to have original thinking. You don't need to think for yourself in order to do it. I believe technology is something very different from globalization. They're often used synonymously, but I think they're almost like the difference between the X and the Y axis. Technology is more vertical. It's going from 0 to 1. And the question is, in going from 0 to 1, you're always doing something new, something that's not been done before, something that probably people don't think actually makes sense to be done. And it's worth asking, what are the kinds of ways of thinking about problems that are more amenable to 0 to 1 versus 1 to N. We tend to be very comfortable with 1 to N because you get reassurance. Everybody wants to have a car. Everybody wants to have a high-speed rail. And you can sort of just look at what crowds of people are doing and say what hundreds of millions of people in the West are doing, billions of people in emerging markets are doing. It's mechanical. It doesn't require any thought at all. And this has been extremely powerful. Globalization's been so powerful because it has required people not to think. And you can actually do very well without thinking. This, I think, has been sort of one of the dark, dirty secrets of the last 40 years, is that even though there are limits to statistics and not thinking and just copying, it's actually worked remarkably well, and people have done really well by not thinking and not trying to do new things. But I think the crisis of the last few years in the West suggests that we've maybe, at least temporarily, hit a limit to extensive growth in the developed world. We need to do something more intensive, and we need to go back to thinking for ourselves and coming up with very new things. I believe this is certainly the only way that things will be dramatically better in 20 years' time. And I think the sort of modality that you have for this is quite different from the modality that's used for globalization, where it's about a consensus of what works. I often, I'll give sort of two anecdotes, one with respect to startups, one with respect to interview questions that I use to try to bring this kind of idea out. So the definitive idea of the future, when you have a company that gets started, they often have a PowerPoint presentation. They will have a slide where they describe what the business is going to do. And you have one type of company where it's, well, we can do many different things. We can do A or B or C or D or E. And you have a company where it's, we are going to do A. The company that says A through E is always worse than the one that just says A, even though mathematically the opposite should be true. Mathematically, you'd say A through E has to be better than just A. But when you have A through E, it means